Good afternoon. I'm Diane Quinn, the Executive Director for the Port Townsend Marine Science Center. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we live and work on the traditional lands of many Coast Salish people, particularly the Sklallam people, the Strong people. We respect and are grateful for this land, these waters, and the people who have inhabited them since time immemorial and who continue to steward this place for future generations. This Future of Oceans lecture series is now in its 10th year, and we have the Darrow family to thank, and they are right in front of me. I just have to, the first time I met the Darrows, when we were talking about the lecture series, Susie said, well, we're partial to phytoplankton, which was not a sentence I had ever heard. So thank you so much for helping us to continue this. In January, on the 14th, we'll have Nam Su here to talk about the intersection of his work as a biologist with the artwork that he does with seaweeds. February, we'll have a Zoom-only talk on the effects of the ocean on our brains and that research. March, we skip, and then April, we have one last talk. So just stay with us. Today, though, this is a great crowd. We're really so happy to have Jim Bodkin here. He was somebody that several people suggested that we reach out to and see if we could get to be part of our series. Jim's been studying sea otters, but marine ecosystems since 1977, at least, probably longer than that. And his work has taken him from Russia to Southern California, and he's published probably more than 150 peer-reviewed articles. I started at 1985 looking at the article about baby elephant seals, and if you just comb through, they're all linked on our website, and you can just see this great curiosity and need to find out about sea otters from every aspect of how not just their lives, but how they interact with other marine life and terrestrial life. And so you can just see the life's work that Jim Bodkin has produced. So he did his master's at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And so you can see the publications kind of matching up with California. But then from 1990 to 2013, he was a research wildlife biologist for USGS at Alaska Science Center in Anchorage. In 2013, he retired. As some of you know what retirement means, which does not mean retirement. And he's continued on as a research biologist for USGS at the Alaska Science Center and continued to publish and just continues to do his work. So the good thing is he lives near us now, and so he could be with us today. And if you didn't make it up earlier, he actually brought show and tell as well as a spectacular set of images to talk to us today about sea otters and conservation stories. So please help me to welcome Jim Bodkin.
Thanks, Diane. Diane's right. I have had the good fortune of spending a career and a bit more engaged in the study and observation of marine life in coastal marine ecosystems from California through Russia. And I'm pleased to be able to come here today and share some of these stories with you. And I'd like to thank you for your participation and your interest in science. It's part of, I think, what motivates us to continue our work. So a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about otters in general and about how sea otters differ from all of the other otters. I'm going to talk a little bit about the nearshore and hopefully provide you with a bit of a different way about thinking about the oceans and how they relate to kind of the offshore oceans as well as the terrestrial parts of the planet Earth. And I'm going to talk about the fur trade and what it meant to sea otters, what it meant to conservation, and what it afforded in the way of an experiment that we could take advantage of in their recovery. And following up on that, we'll talk a little bit about the biology and the ecology of sea otters, and with a bit of a focus on the knowledge that was gained because of this experiment that I'll describe in a little more detail. And then near the end, I'm going to talk about how oceans and the terrestrial systems are linked by this nearshore habitat, this narrow piece of the oceans that reflect processes that occur both on the land and on at sea. And then lastly, for a bit of a light part of it, I'm going to show a short video on how to catch a sea otter. If you ever find yourself in the need to do that and you have the correct permits, which is kind of a challenging part of it. So there's 13 species of otters that occur pretty much around the world, from about 60 degrees north to about 60 degrees south. And most of those are semi-aquatic, meaning they spend some time in the water, mostly in terms of feeding, but they spend much of their time when they're not feeding on land, either resting, grooming, or in other types of behaviors. Many of these other otters are threatened by habitat loss related to rivers and drainages and modifications of those rivers, pollution in those rivers, and there's continuing harvest on many of these other otters around the globe. But we're going to focus on the most recent mammal to return to the sea. And it's unique in that regard in that, it has a relatively short time of being totally marine. And that's probably on the order of 6 million years, which seems like a long time, of course. But from the perspective of evolution and adaptation from a semi-aquatic livelihood to a completely marine one, there's some real challenges in regards to that. So what is the difference between a sea otter and a river otter? Well, most of the differences that are obvious to our eye have to do with the size and the shape and the coloration of the sea otter, which happens to be about 4 times larger than the average river otter. There's a giant otter that approaches the sea otter in terms of its length, but it's only about half the size in terms of its weight. So the largest sea otter that we've captured and weighed has been 112 pounds. Kind of the average adult male weighs about 60 to 75 pounds, but it's not unusual to have an 80 or a 90-pound animal. And an adult female will weigh 50 to 70 pounds. But some of the things that you can see in this image here are the hind flippers of the sea otter. So they're enlarged, they're webbed, and they're almost spread out in this image, but not quite. But on the right side, you can see the river otter, and they still have, basically they have claws on their hind flippers, and they're not enlarged. So the sea otter swims more like a seal than the other otters. So it uses its whole body in an undulation type of a movement in order to swim through the water. It doesn't use its forepaws. Whereas the river otters and all of the other otters are using both of their appendages for their locomotion. You can see the difference in the size. And if you'd like, when we're done this afternoon, there's a sea otter pelt and a river otter pelt and a couple of skulls of each of these animals that are here. One of the big modifications that the sea otter has is it's adapted to feeding on a totally different field of prey, and it's marine invertebrates, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But one of their adaptations is their dentition is modified for crushing as opposed to cutting, as most of the carnivores are. Both of these are diving animals. The sea otter dives to up to 100 meters, 300 feet, but mostly it's diving at less than 50 meters, where the river otter is diving about to 10 to 20 meters or so. So that's a couple of the kind of the differences between these. They both have fur. The sea otter has a greatly modified fur to keep an air layer for its insulation. So it uses air rather than blubber for insulation. And it also uses metabolic heat. So because of that, it's consuming about 25% of its body weight a day. So a 100-pound sea otter is going to eat 25 pounds of food a day. And as a result of that, it's metabolic heat that's keeping him warm, or her, in addition to the insulation provided by the fur and the air. So the reason that they're susceptible to contaminants and pollution is if it degrades the ability of that fur to hold air, they lose the ability to maintain their body temperatures, and hypothermia is an issue. The shape of the sea otter is a little bit different. It's long and kind of fusiform, and again, so it can dive and swim at a rapid rate. But again, one of the big differences is the diets between all of the other otters and the sea otter, and we'll talk quite a bit about that more. So life history attributes. Sea otters are polygynous. The males in a population represent a relatively small fraction, less than half, probably maybe a third to 40% of the total number are males. They have a higher mortality rate than females from an early age that continues through life. And that's a pretty common phenomenon on polygynous animals, and particularly those where males have to defend territories. There's a price to pay. Most of the habitat in well-established populations is occupied by adult females and their offspring, and they're pretty much allowed to travel between territories. It might become difficult when they enter estrus because there's a male that's associated with the territory that they happen to be in, so sometimes they'll sequester females within their territories, but really the territoriality is defined to limit access to females by other males. Which again contributes to that higher mortality rate in the males. Let's see, so they give birth to a single pup, the female does. They gestate for 6 months. They lactate for 6 months. They're essentially either lactating or gestating for the rest of their lives once they reach age 3 or 4. And we haven't seen any kind of senescence in that reproduction as they age. They continue that until at least near death. And mortality tends to be, again, biased towards males, but also biased towards the young and the old, which is not really to be unexpected. So similar to the pinnipeds, rather than the other otters, sea otters have adapted to life in the sea by the constraint placed on raising young. So the river otter or the other otters, they can go ashore and have young, and they can keep track of their young and raise them on land, and they can actually go out to feed and come back to land. But in the case of the sea otter and all of the other marine mammals, they're limited in their ability to care for more than one in most circumstances. So, and sea otters almost never, and I'll say almost because it's happened that they have had twins, but they've never been able to raise twins, and most of the time, where we see most of the twins is in fetuses of animals that were harvested in years gone by. Let's see, did I talk about longevity? 20 years is the maximum for the sea otter. In captivity, they can actually live a little longer, and 15 years is probably more like the average for the female and slightly less for the male. Whereas the river otter is only going to live to 3 to 5 years of age, so they have a higher reproductive rate, but over the lifetime it's much less. Okay, so that's a bit about the basic biology, and going to cut this a little bit short so that we have time for questions about some of the things that I may have passed over. So we're going to move on to oceans, and I appreciated the comment about phytoplankton, because I'm going to talk a little bit about phytoplankton here. But I think we all have a vision of what the ocean is, right? I mean, we look out at it and we see what occupies 2/3 of our planet, and but we really can't see much of it from the surface. But it's a dominant feature of our planet. And the other dominant feature of our planet, of course, is the Earth, is the terrestrial systems, which by the processes of erosion and gravitation are eventually filling up our oceans. But that's not something we need to worry about, at least in the near term. Although the sediments in the process of transport of materials from rivers and continents is an important attribute of this area that I'm going to call the nearshore, that lies between the oceans and the continents. And I'm going to just propose that there's a couple of different ways to think about these food webs. And I realize that there's many food webs in the ocean, and there's deep basin food webs, but I think the most recognizable food web is the one that's driven by phytoplankton at the bottom of the food web where the primary production is coming from. And zooplankton, things like copepods, feed that food web up into the higher trophic levels of fishes and invertebrates and eventually birds and mammals. It's a food web that's generally considered to be nutrient limited, and it's one that's stratified by temperature and by salinity. And the process of mixing takes place by atmospheric conditions related to winds and the rotation of the Earth. And so kind of that's a broad overview of one way to look at the oceans. And so I want to focus a little bit more on this nearshore system where kelps and seaweeds and seagrasses are the primary producers in the system. They're the dominant source of carbon in this ocean system. There's a benthic invertebrate pathway that leads from organisms, small things like mysids, up through the benthic invertebrates, things like clams and crabs and mussels and urchins that feed that primary production up to the upper level carnivores, things like sea stars and octopus and other vertebrates, fishes, birds, and mammals, including the sea otter. Substrates in critical importance here because most things are attached here, and that's because they need to be because of the effects of waves and ocean conditions that can influence that near shore. And obviously depth is a critical, and light penetration is a driving force behind this near shore system. So I hope you can think about the near shore in a different way, because that near shore is in fact the home and the habitat of the sea otter. And it's what defines sea otter habitat. Okay, we're going to move on to the maritime fur trade. So over 250 years, beginning in 1750, shortly after Bering's explorations across the North Pacific, a commercial harvest took place. And over the next 250 years, probably close to 1 million sea otters were harvested out of the North Pacific. And at the end of that harvest, which basically ended because of scarcity, but also because of protections by the International Fur Seal Treaty, the harvest was over about 1900. And at that time, 11 small populations remained, most of those across the Aleutian Islands, a couple in Russia, and one in California. So I had a slide up here of science and experiments, and it had Petri dishes and pipettes and data sheets and things that we think about as experiments that take place regularly. And at least my earlier perception of experiment really took place over maybe days, maybe hours, maybe weeks, but they were pretty short-termed and pretty small scale. They took place in the laboratory. But I'd like you to think about this fur trade and the effects on sea otters as a grand experiment, one that took place over 150 years and what took place over the entire expanse of the North Pacific. So what we have, the gray shaded area here represents the original historic distribution of sea otters from the northern islands of Japan across the Pacific Rim down to the central coast of Baja California. We don't know how many animals were here prior to the trade, but there's a couple of estimates that are in the range of 300,000 animals. There's some others that are slightly less, and there's some others that are slightly gray. But that's maybe a good ballpark figure to work with. There's 11 populations that persisted, most of those across the Aleutians, and we really don't have any concept of what the abundance was in those, but it was likely, in double digits perhaps, maybe in the small triple digits, but it's unlikely that there was more than, 1,000 animals overall, over total. We know that in California there was, the first sighting was the first count was in 1950, or was it 38? I can't remember, but it was 50 animals in 38. So that gives you an idea. That was 40 years after the end of the fur trade, and the population hadn't really changed. If it hadn't changed much, there was 50 animals left. If it had grown any, there was probably a few dozen at the most. So it gives you a sense of how rare this animal was. So this forms kind of the foundation for that experiment. Another part of this, and an important part of this experiment, was that during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there were additional translocations or reintroductions of sea otters from the Aleutian Islands, represented by these two red circles, down to, there was 4 reintroductions into Southeast Alaska. There were reintroductions to British Columbia, Washington, and California, and then most recently, in the 1980s, a translocation from Central California down to San Nicolas Island. So these reintroductions into their prior habitat provided another replication of the experimental design. So essentially we can look at sea otter habitat in the presence and in the absence of sea otters, and we can't look at sea otters that way, but we can look at sea otters in terms of when they're newly established and then over time after they're long established. And so I want to talk a little bit about those two kind of comparisons. Okay, just to give you a sense of the recovery of sea otters, because this is really a great conservation story. Sea otters were over-harvested, almost to the brink of extinction, and they were protected. And so this chart starts when they were protected, 1911, assuming that there was, I think, a few hundred animals. And you can see the rate of increase up into the almost 1990. There's almost 90,000 animals. And there was almost certainly more like 100 or more thousand animals at that time. You'll see there's a slight decline or change in that trajectory, and I'll talk about that a bit later. So that was the remnant population, that basically they were protected and they increased because the harvest didn't damage the habitat. And in the absence of sea otters, their prey populations kind of expanded. So they had unlimited space and they had abundant food. So they were able to achieve kind of their maximum reproductive rates and the maximum population increase. Although that rate in many cases wasn't as great as it was in these translocated populations, which those were introduced into vacant habitats. So they didn't have any, they had unlimited space in that sense because they weren't in any internal competition, and they had abundant food. So, and this plot starts in 1965, I think, when the reintroductions took place. And as of today, there's probably 30 or 40,000 sea otters that are the result of those reintroductions. So another great example of a conservation program that was maybe not with that intent to increase the abundance, there was a motivation initially to resurrect a harvest for the fur, but that was diminished over time, and it's no longer really a consideration. So these plots illustrate kind of the capacity of sea otters to recover and the success of the conservation. So what have we learned about recovery? Well, the protections, they were sufficient. They were sufficient to begin the process of recovery. And the translocations were of significant benefit in augmenting those remnant populations. One of the important things that we learned in this process of studying sea otters and this process of recovery is that unlike all of the other marine mammals, these animals have exceptionally small home ranges. Some of them are on the order of a few square blocks, and those would be the male territories. They tend to have the smallest home ranges because they have, well, the less amount of habitat you have to protect, the easier it can be. Females have home ranges, annual home ranges that might be 10 to 20 square kilometers. So they don't move much, and they have a high site fidelity. If we take them out, move them to another location, they're going to try to return. In fact, they've done that. That San Nicolas translocation I mentioned, we moved 139 animals there, and within a year they were down to 12 at that site, and many of those animals were back in their home territories on the Big Sur coast. So that's a really important aspect of sea otters and sea otter conservation in terms of future management and future conservation. All right, so I suspect everybody is interested in sea otters in Washington, so this is a sidebar. It'll take one slide. It shows the distribution of sea otters from about Neah Bay, just to the east of Cape Flattery, down to about Clay Lock. There's about 3,000 sea otters there. They were moved, there was 91 of them moved there, I think I said that, in 1969 and 1970. These two stars represent a couple of sightings. In the one down in near Olympia was several years ago, and the one in Friday Harbor, near Friday Harbor on the San Juan Islands was, I saw a sea otter there 2 years ago. They're rare. There's about 8,000 sea otters in British Columbia that are now moving across the Straits of Juan de Fuca. Whether or not and when they move into the Straits and into Puget Sound in the Salish Sea is anybody's guess. I will say that they're relatively rare in the middens of the Salish Sea. They're very abundant on the outer coasts. So, but they certainly occur in inland protected waters everywhere else. This may be it's one of the few areas that is where their history is poorly known. Okay, I think that's it for Washington, right? Okay, some lessons from the grand experiment. In the next few slides, I'm going to show highlights of some of the biological and ecological opportunities that were enabled by this grand experiment. And I'm going to give you a hint here in this slide. It's related to sea urchins and it's related to kelps. So, but basic biology and the life history attributes, I talked a little bit about those, about the longevity, and I don't think that that's different between kind of recently occupied and long occupied populations. But there are some differences in terms of their age at first reproduction. So the female can mature at 2 years in areas where they have abundant food and abundant space. So these places where they're being reintroduced to. And their survival rates tend to be much higher where they have abundant food and abundant space. I mean, this is not rocket science, but it's pretty intuitive, and it's been demonstrated in other mammals that you give animals abundant resources and they prosper. Diet. So, one of the great things about sea otters from a biologist's perspective is that, and amongst the carnivores, it's very rare to be able to identify, to watch a carnivore eat. But sea otters dive to the bottom, they bring their prey up to the surface, and they live near shore, so we can see them with telescopes. And not only can we identify what they're eating, we can identify the size of what they're eating and the number of what they're eating. And by knowing the caloric content of that prey, we can estimate the energy intake rates. So what we have found is that sea otters in newly occupied habitat are having to spend about 25% of their day feeding, 6 hours a day, which is still, a significant part of their day. But in populations that are at or near equilibrium density, that have been present for decades in their habitats, they're actually feeding for about 50% of the day, or 12 hours a day they're feeding. So they're spending a large amount of their day acquiring the energy that they need to stay warm. The behaviors, I talked about the home ranges. So one of the things that happened in this experiment is that when we look at home ranges and movements of animals where food is unlimited and space is unlimited, their small home ranges and their fidelity to those home ranges evaporates. They no longer have the constraint of needing to acquire resources in competition with other otters. So they can form huge rafts and densities, and they're no longer tied to having to defend territories, and that whole breeding system kind of breaks down. But they are mustelids, and they manage to reproduce in the absence of those territories. And then in terms of population biology, growth rates are dependent largely on the amount of food that they have available. So where food is abundant, the growth rates are at the maximum, which is about 25% a year, 20 to 25% a year. And those diminish as resources become limiting down to near zero. And I'll talk a little bit later about things that are maybe driving populations down. Okay. So prey. Over 150 different species have been identified as part of the sea otter's diet. But most of those can be categorized in a few broad taxonomic categories. Things, again, like the clams, the urchins, the echinoderms, the bivalves and the gastropods. Things like mussels and abalone and clams and snails, crustaceans, crabs, octopus, a wide variety of items in their diet. And in their absence, over the decades and centuries that they may have been absent, their prey responded to the absence of the sea otter as the predator. And they increased in abundance, and they increased in their average size. And as a result, humans started developing fisheries on these. I mean, we've all heard of the fisheries that humans have developed on invertebrates, things like urchins and clams and crabs and abalone, just to mention a few. And those have occasionally been contentious and resulted in conflict. And I'm not going to talk about that, other than to say, in most cases, the sea otter won. So the direct effects on prey, they're pretty well known. And again, we have to think about what these effects are in the absence, in the prolonged absence of this predator when they're reintroduced. And so because the prey had increased in abundance so much, it's fairly clear that they reduce the density and the abundance and the biomass of these prey. What's not clear is the duration of that effect. There's evidence that's accumulating now that as sea otters persist in their communities and with their prey, that there's periodic eruptions in different prey items that are due to the types of life history that those prey have, which is a life history that's based on exploding numbers of propagules that are put out into the near shore and into the oceans that periodically have great success, but periodically have complete failure. So it's a complex dynamic, and one that we need to think about when we consider what we've learned about watching sea otters recover habitat and what it might look like when sea otters are no longer recovering but have fully occupied that habitat for extended periods of time. So because of these interactions with sea otters and their prey, they've become widely known as a keystone species in the system. And I suspect that most of you are familiar with that concept, and I'll talk about it a little bit related to sea urchins, kelps, and sea otters. But I want to point out that sea otters occur in all of these coastal habitats from the range that I explained, from the intertidal out to depths of at least 50 meters and out potentially further, including exposed open coastlines, kelp forests, rocky reefs, eelgrass systems, soft sediments, bays, and estuaries. They occupy all of these habitats. And the role that sea otters play in coupling ecosystems, in coupling the marine and the terrestrial ecosystems, is something that we've only really come to realize and appreciate more in more recent years. Okay, so the urchin, otter, kelp paradigm, which has been replicated throughout the range of the sea otter, with the exception of Southern California, where sea otters really haven't occurred fully yet. So I'm not going to talk about the nuances about that. But basically, when sea otters are abundant, sea urchins are rare and they're small. And as a result, kelps become prolific and abundant, and they dominate the system, and they dominate the primary productivity in that system. And those kelp forest habitats support a variety of invertebrates that rely on that, and vertebrates, fishes in particular, and some birds. And those kelp forests act in various ways to mediate influences of wave events and other oceanographic processes. They act as filters, actually, for propagules of ocean, both marine or nearshore and oceanic propagules that are drifting along shore. But in the absence of sea otters, urchins will come to dominate the system. And these types of urchin barons, as they've kind of been known, can dominate large portions of this nearshore zone. And they virtually can exclude primary production from the kelps and seagrasses and the seaweeds. And just a couple of images here of what these urchin barons look like, which in some cases supported fisheries, such as urchin fisheries. Okay, some ecological generalities. And these are very general. So sea otters will usually reduce the number and the sizes of their preferred prey once they reoccupy former habitat. How long that maintains is something that we're interested in continuing to look at. But we're fairly confident that this shift results in increased nearshore primary production and increased species diversity and system biomass and probably ecosystem resilience. And it increases this ecosystem coupling. And so that's what I'm going to talk about next, is these kelp forests and what they mean to the near shore, because I'm sure you're all aware of the apparent abundance of kelp forests, particularly along the coast, and these kelp forests occur throughout the range of the sea otter. So there's, it's not a matter of do sea otters need kelp, it's a matter of does the kelp need sea otters? And the fact is that they do. So just an image of a kelp forest, and here's another image of a kelp forest. And so most of the kelps, almost all of them, are annuals. They reproduce and senesce annually, and they often wash up ashore, and they often sit there on the shore and they degrade over time. But in the process of degrading, they're supporting invertebrate communities that are fed on by both larger invertebrates, by birds, and by small mammals. So this is where kelps can end up, and they often do. And the reality is that these kelps feed the near shore. So in many cases, and for many of these prey species, for many of these invertebrates and some of the fishes, the carbon in their system, in their bodies, is up to 90% derived from these kelps, okay? So these kelp forests, they're photosynthesizing, they're primary producers, they're growing, they're dying, they're going ashore, they're degrading, and that carbon is being cycled into these nearshore food webs, okay? I think that's why I wanted you to think about the nearshore a little bit different than the ocean. And the nearshore, in turn, feeds the land. And I'm just going to show you a few, I don't know, examples of how they might do that. And this is an example of a recovering sea otter population in Katmai National Park that took place about 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's slowly been recovering. And as it has, wolves have started preying on sea otters and scavenging sea otters. So this happens to be a case where this wolf predated this sea otter and was taking it up to be consumed. In other cases, these sea otter carcasses wash ashore and they become a source of nutrients from the marine system that are being transported where they're scavenged by various types of animals. So the whales are one of the largest packets of biomass on our planet. And historically, they were much more abundant. And I'm going to touch on that. But today even, they still die and they still wash ashore. And in this case, they provide a huge subsidy from the ocean to support a variety of marine or terrestrial carnivores and predators. In this case, a couple of brown bears. There was actually 3 other bears feeding on this whale down near the middle of it and at the other end of it. But I chose to focus on these 2 that were up near the head. Okay, so I've talked about what the fur trade enabled. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what the fur trade cost us. And so for the past 20,000 years, give or take a few thousand years, humans have coexisted with sea otters along the coastlines and developed relationships with those and knowledge and cultures, employed sea otters in their livelihoods and in their cultures. And much of that was lost when sea otters were removed from those cultures for multiple generations. So that has to do with one of the severe losses of that fur trade. And sea otters were fairly easy to restore. I don't know about those cultural losses. But we're going to talk about the killer whale now and the sea otter. And so industrial whaling continued in the North Pacific until the early 1970s, just in the last century. And those great whale populations were reduced by approximately 90%. So that will likely have effects on the number of whales that get deposited on the shoreline to feed those terrestrial ecosystems. But it also had ramifications to the remaining marine mammals in the North Pacific. And so this is a well-supported hypothesis that's not universally supported. So after the industrial whaling ended, killer whales' diet shifted, or transient killer whales' diet shifted to pinnipeds, seals, and sea lions that drastically declined in the late 1990s. And next on that menu was the 100,000 or so sea otters that occurred across the Aleutian archipelago. Sea otters today number about 10,000, about a 90% decline in sea otters across the Aleutian Islands, which is in part responsible for the lack of that continued growth in that plot that I first showed you regarding remnant populations. And sea otters only occur now in the Aleutians along a very narrow band of shallow water where sea otters have access to escape from predation by going ashore. And this situation has existed now for 30 or so, 40 years, and there hasn't been a recovery of sea otters in the Aleutians yet. Nobody knows what the future holds. So now we're going to end with how to catch a sea otter. And I'm going to give you a little narration of this, but essentially, sorry, I just... So we usually get in the water maybe 200 to 400 yards away from resting sea otters, and we use these scooters and traps, and we'll travel along underwater, usually at 10 or 20 feet below the surface, periodically rising up to make course corrections and to make sure that the animals are still there. And we'll signal the other diver only one diver will go up, and we'll signal about how far. This diver is saying it's, I think, 25 meters to the sea otters. And here you're going to look up, you can see 4 sea otters, 2 mothers and pups, and each of those were captured separately. Each trap had a mother and pup. And it's going to continue on, and you'll see the capture sequence in slow motion now. So, but you can see, because of the lack of air bubbles, because we're using rebreathers, there's no disturbance to these animals, and they're oblivious to our presence for the most part. Yeah, sometimes they'll roll over and take a look and see us, and then it's over. But for the most part, it's probably the safest way we catch sea otters, at least traumatic to them, because it's a very short, it's pretty traumatic, I'm sure, when they get eaten up by an alien. But it's fairly short-lived. They're very rapidly transported to a boat and to a ship or on shore, where they're sedated, and whatever we're going to do to them gets done, and then they're back in the water when the anesthesia is reversed. So that's how you catch a sea otter. Anybody have questions or would like to talk about Thanks.
When you look at the urchin barrens, and you envision sea otters coming to the smorgasbord, you envision them having lots and lots to eat, but no place to hide. What kind of a lag time do you see from the reintroduction of sea otters into areas where the urchins have decimated the kelp and the reestablishment of a healthy ecosystem?
So there's the duration from introduction to kelp can be rapid. It can be on the order of months, weeks to months. Was some interesting work done that actually looked at a flight response of urchins to dead and consumed urchins that had been eaten, because the urchins aren't eaten whole. They're only eating the gonads out of them. They're breaking them open. So those tests, the urchin tests that were falling to the bottom, elicited a fleet response in the urchins in that area. So in that case, it could happen very quickly, but typically it takes, so there needs to be a seed, if you will, for the kelps to get established, but they have fairly long dispersal capabilities, so it can take place in a year. But that's just moving from the urchin barren to the kelp forest. You know, the development of the ecosystem, the kelp forest ecosystem with all of the species and all of the ecological functions that take place probably takes years and decades. Nice question, thanks, that was good.
Would the presence of killer whales in the Salish Sea reduce the odds of sea otters becoming reestablished here or established?
I think theoretically, absolutely. Again, this is one of those things that the perspective of time has not allowed us to really observe or think about. But since we've seen what's happened in the Aleutians, predation, not only from killer whales, because I'll make a note that in California right now, the presence of increasing white shark populations is kind of limiting the range expansion of sea otters there. So marine predators have always been in this system, and they likely have played important roles that have gone unobserved because of this, the restriction of the perspective of time that we had. So it's quite likely that the reason that sea otters are rare in the middens in the Salish Sea is that they were being reduced or in abundance by other predators. It could be humans. It could have been sharks. It could have been killer whales. It could have been some other predator that we're unaware of. So the answer is yes.
I have a quick question, or a question about behavior of sea otters. And if you have an adult, female sea otter, you were talking about the male lifespan being shorter than females and populations being mostly female. What is the behavior? How does a female encourage the little ones to move on independently? Is that an active event, or does they just sort of swim away?
Right. So it's hard. It's hard to observe the process of weaning of an offspring. But in a couple of occasions, we have seen it. We've seen marked animals take their pup from the areas where they raised them and take them 20 kilometers away to a place that had abundant food and abundant space, and wean their pup there, and then the mom went back. And so that's the kind of mechanism that needs to be in place in order to maintain a density. I did want to clarify that the relative abundance of males and females is not highly skewed. Maybe 40% male in the adult population and 60% female. But most of the habitat is occupied by those breeding females and those territories held by males. The surplus males, if you will, tend to occupy either what we would view as less desirable habitat or at the fringes of occupied habitat in these newly occupied areas. But these areas maintain, in Amchitka Island and the Aleutians, we've observed over the past 60 years the same male areas being occupied by these non-territorial males. And we've observed the general process of territories, reproductive territories, being occupied by clearly not the same males, but occupied over time.
Hi. When you were talking about all the otters that you were trying to reestablish somewhere else, but then many of them ended up going back. Do you know if that was, were they just a bunch of individuals, or are they coming in family units, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we didn't move any females and pups, and that is really the only family unit that the sea otter has. It is the mother and pup. Otherwise, they're independent animals that have their own home ranges and their own relationships, if you will, with other animals. But we didn't target animals that were related or were associated with one another. So it was we tried to make a random selection, and maybe that was a problem. But they went back to their home ranges, and we don't know if they went back singularly or as groups, but we do know that many of the marked animals made it back to their home ranges, but not all of them. And we don't know what happened to some of those. I don't know if they have the ability to navigate across oceans. And San Nicolas Island, where we moved them to, is about 60 miles offshore. So if they just, if they swam north, and were able to find shallow enough water to feed along the way, they could probably survive traveling all the way back up to, southeast Alaska or however far they went. But in the event that they ended up, not being able to feed along the way, they're not going to live for very long without feeding, maybe on the order of a couple of days.
Hi. I heard there was an inkling of an idea to relocate sea otters to the Oregon coast, but that was a couple years ago. Are there any recent developments regarding that movement?
There are. Great, because I was going to talk about that and I thought I don't have enough time. But there isn't a movement. There's an alliance called the Elakha Alliance. It's a consortium of 6 tribes along the coast of Oregon who have formed this Elakha Alliance with the objective of reintroducing sea otters to Oregon. I didn't mention that the Oregon reintroduction in the 1970s failed for unknown reasons. But the Elakha Alliance has made continuing progress in developing plans and progress towards another reintroduction. And interestingly, the emphasis of their reintroduction is not necessarily only the conservation of sea otters, but it's the restoration of coastal marine ecosystems along the coast of Oregon for precisely some of the reasons that I talked about today. So I thought a couple of things. One is that, that if any organization has the political will, it would be the community of indigenous peoples that suffered the greatest losses from the fur trade. And for the reasons of restoring an ecosystem rather than conserving a species, or in addition to conserving a species. So I think that they have a long road to hoe, but they're making progress, and I wouldn't be surprised if they gain some success. It'll take years to get there, but they're making progress in that direction.
I'm just curious about an image earlier in your slideshow. It was of a skeleton of an adult with a pup mummified, and what could have been a reason for mortality like that? Both of them.
No, I'm sorry. The mortality was the sea otter, the carcass. Yeah, I've kind of put that in to remind myself to talk a little bit about mortality, but I don't think that there was a pup involved. It was a single adult, but I didn't. I mean, I could go back and look, but I don't think there was a pup in that. Yeah, part of the carcass. We do see lots of pups, and we do see lots of adults. And if the mom dies with a small pup, the pup is going to die as well. They're pretty much unable to dive until they're a couple months old. They're probably unable to feed themselves until they're 4 or 5 months old, and so that weaning process is that's what probably the highest rate of mortality comes in that post weaning period when they're being kind of weaned from mom's care.
Are there disease processes prevalent in the sea otter population?
Disease process?
Disease.
Yeah, they are. There's a number of diseases, and they can be responsible for modifying survival rates. We don't have any evidence that, of course, those modified survival rates are going to impact populations. They're going to reduce the growth rate in the population, or they're going to drive the trajectory. We don't have any evidence that diseases may kind of have mass mortality, but again, it's entirely possible that could take place. You're getting into a realm that I'm in dangerous waters on, deep water maybe, but there's a number of parasites that are prevalent. They're susceptible to harmful algal blooms, are known to cause some mortality. Toxoplasma is a disease that's common in California, and it's been found in populations as far north as the Gulf of Alaska. Toxoplasma sarcocystis is another one. And a couple of these parasites, these diseases and parasites are related potentially to human activities in watersheds and the expulsion of propagules from those organisms into the marine environment and then being consumed by sea otters. I don't know that we have any kind of historic capacity to look at diseases as a factor regulating abundance. Yeah, thank you.
Can you reflect on any possible interconnections or interrelationships between sea otter conservation and restoration and climate change?
Oh, yeah. Sure, I can reflect or speculate. I'm not sure which one, but so it's a good question, and it's one that we've been thinking a lot about, for obvious reasons. But so warming temperatures, at least at the rates that are projected, are unlikely to have adverse effects. Their southern distribution is limited more by ocean productivity rather than temperatures. Their northern limit is reflected by ice, and they're perfectly capable of living at the edge of ice. So a warming climate that results in maybe expansion of their range to the north and maybe contraction of their range at the south, perhaps, we don't know, is possible. Probably more likely the effects of climate change, at least the initial ones, will be indirect based on ocean acidification and the types of prey that sea otters consume, many of them being consisting of calcium carbonate in shells that might be susceptible to increasing acidification. I think that's the most likely culprit or to have an effect on sea otters. And that's been pretty well demonstrated in the laboratory. Taking it into the wild hasn't, of course, been done yet. So kelps do sequester a good deal of CO2. The carbon in the kelps and the seagrasses, and there's been some work that has identified, estimated actually the contribution of kelps worldwide to mitigating climate change. But where I kind of get a little bit, you think about that carbon and the cycling of that carbon through the photosynthesis, and I don't know that they're sequestering it over the long range, over the long term, because it's turning over rather rapidly, and it's coming back into that food chain. I guess some of the kelps that actually, some of it ends up in the deep oceans, and so from there, perhaps it is more permanently sequestered there. But yeah, disease and climate change, I try to stay away from things that I have to, at my age, I have to focus. Surprisingly, she asked what the most nutritious prey item is for sea otters, pound for pound or ounce for ounce. And the work that's been done using stable isotopes, bomb calorimetry, is sea stars when they're gravid. So, one of the great things, again, I know, who would have thought? But when sea stars are gravid, those gonads have a very high nutritional quality to them. And I think the same could be said for almost all of those invertebrates. You look at a Dungeness crab that's gravid. The energy content goes way up for species. And I don't know, I'm pretty sure actually that we haven't bombed all of the prey items. I think we've bombed almost all the prey items that sea otters eat, but we haven't been able to do that for those species that they consume most frequently that are also gravid, when they're gravid, and potentially have huge energy resources at that time. I wouldn't be surprised if sea otters have a strategy and a knowledge base because most of these invertebrates have pretty clear cycles to their reproductive processes. And it wouldn't be outside of speculation to think that sea otters are capable of identifying or knowing when mussels are gravid, when sea stars are gravid, when all of their prey, when crabs are gravid, because those are very seasonal. There's a very cyclic attribute to that reproduction in those invertebrates. Yeah.
So the otters that I see here around town that are going into the sea, I can't call them sea otters.
You can call them whatever you like, but call them otters in the sea. They're almost certainly river otters. Yeah.
River otters. And so then a sea otter spends its no time on land except to escape prey. They're in the water the whole time.
Correct. They never have to leave the water. They can occasionally haul out, and they'll haul out on sandbars. There's places in Alaska where they can haul out where they're so most pinniped, most of the marine mammals that haul out on land, they were limited by terrestrial predators, bears and wolves and cougars and whatever, but so they couldn't haul out on land unless they had it was an island or it was a habitat that was where terrestrial predators couldn't take advantage of their presence, primarily through the predation of their young, because most of the adults could escape those predators. So yeah, sea otters don't have to haul out. They can when they need to, but otherwise they can spend their entire lives at sea.
And you're probably not going to want to hear it. As a transplant from Alaska, I'm really curious. I know you did a lot of research from the Exxon oil spill.
Yeah.
And the last report I remember from 2014, the trustee council made a claim that after 20, 25 years, the habitat is completely restored and the sea otter numbers are back to what they were pre-spill. Fast forward, it is now 2023. I'm curious what your opinion is on that.
Well, I was responsible for writing that report. So
I'm sorry.
But I will say that since 2014, the population of sea otters in western Prince William Sound that were affected by the oil spill have continued to increase. I would qualify what you said, though, that there is almost certainly still Exxon Valdez oil in the subtidal nearshore sediments in localized areas in Prince William Sound, but small, relatively small amounts. So, but I think we were correct in 2014. But I won't speak to the habitats particularly because I kind of disagree that they were fully recovered because there was still oil there.
And that's from my experience working on that spill.
Yeah.
And so what would be your projection or your guesstimate now looking at 2023, what those populations might be like?
Oh, we actually have numbers. So we've continued to monitor the abundance of sea otters in Prince William Sound after the spill. We don't do it as frequently now. We used to do it every year and at a much larger rate, but we've continued it, and I couldn't tell you, but I want to say that heavily impacted area of Prince William Sound, there were about 2,000 animals. There were less than 2,000 animals there shortly after the spill. And today, I would guess that there's probably 3,500. They got back up to 2,000 or so by 2014, or whatever we would have projected the population to have been prior to the spill. And now it's continued to increase, and we don't really know why. Okay.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Jim Bodkin.